All right, so this video is focused on the mechanics of coiling in the disc golf backhand throw. So first of all, what is coiling? So it generally refers to this whole mechanism of twisting back. If I'm throwing this way, I'm twisting back so that my chest is kind of facing away, almost 180 degrees away from where I'm throwing. Now notice I haven't reached my arm back yet. So coiling, to me, I define it as the whole system of this twisting to create tension and load up the muscles and create this range of motion to then rotate powerfully. So that's separate from the reach back, which would be, reaching the arm out. However, the reach back, of course, connects in to all this coiling tension, ultimately connects into the arm through the upper back. But that will be for the reach back video. All right, so first, let's make sure we can feel the different pieces of coiling, because it's not just one thing. So the first piece is what's usually called shoulder coiling. So sit down on something stationary, so not a swiveling chair. You could even just sit down on the floor with your legs out in front of you, and then without swiveling, you're just going to twist through your spine. So this is shoulder coil. Notice how my shoulders are moving, but I'm focusing on twisting through my spine. And you can see the range of motion I have. As soon as I get to like here, my legs start wanting to move as well, because it's not a huge range of motion. And you should feel the tension. You should feel that you need to start flexing your core a little bit as you do that. And this is part of the reason people don't coil, because it's hard. It takes effort. Now, I kind of don't like the term shoulder coil, because when people think of the shoulders, instead of just twisting the spine, which then makes the shoulders move, they think of the shoulders, and so then they kind of do this with their arm because they feel like they're using their shoulders here. But this is not coiling. This is just putting your arm across your chest, and this is called horizontal collapse, because horizontally here, this space right here collapses inward, and the upper arm is now touching my chest, and this is bad. That's for another video. All right, so the term shoulder coil is so prevalent that I don't want to completely fight it, but I think it can be helpful to think about it a little bit differently, as I just described, thinking about it as twisting your spine, which then makes your shoulders turn. All right, the next piece of coiling is rear hip coil, which is internal rotation of the back hip. So this is internal rotation of the back hip. You see how I'm pivoting my foot on the ground like this? But if I don't pivot my foot and I instead lift up my front foot, now when I internally rotate this rear hip, my whole body rotates around that leg. So from the back view, and now notice my front foot is now very closed. If I'm throwing this way, my front foot is very closed, but I did not internally rotate my front foot. If I internally rotated my front foot, it would look like this. So the front foot being closed, a big part of it is simply not externally rotating the front foot, and then additionally rear hip coiling, which naturally is just twisting, turning your whole body like this and getting your front foot a little bit more closed. Now, the other thing that's important, and this is why I defined shoulder coil first, is you'll notice my shoulders are turning when I'm doing this, but I am not shoulder coiling. I have not twisted through my spine yet. I've only internally rotated here on this back leg. Now, if I put my arm out with a 90-degree angle here, and I now twist through my spine, I'm all the way back here. So if I'm throwing this way, I would, if I were to coil this much, which is my maximum, I would widen my reach back so it's lined up with where I'm throwing. You don't have to. From here, from that position, it's not rounding, even though it may look like it. So hip coil max, now reach the arm out. Shoulder coil max. If I just bend the elbow here, the disc is in front of my chest the whole time, so my body's never in the way. Just clearing that up separately. So the people who run up backwards instead of coiling, they're basically, instead of rear hip coiling like this, it's like you're pivoting your foot backwards so that you don't have to rear hip coil. And now it feels like, or it seems like you're in a coiled position because you're facing away from the target, but I've done no twisting. So if I were to, from this position, rear hip coil, and now shoulder coil, I'm almost facing the target again. So yeah, don't turn everything backwards together. There's no separation there. There's no twisting. There's no tension. The only thing you can do if you do that is try to spin really fast, which is, you can get some decent distances, but it's very limited and more likely to fall. So the rear hip coil is creating tension or separation between your foot and the ground, and your hip here. I feel this tension, and to relieve this tension, I can pivot my foot, and now that tension is relieved. But now I've lost the power that comes from that tension. And the hip to shoulder separation is just that right now my shoulders have turned back because my whole body has rotated on the rear hip with the rear hip coil, and then the hip to shoulder separation is now adding that twist through the spine. So people who have their foot not totally turned backwards, but slightly turned backwards, they may not be rear hip coiling enough, because as I showed you, if my foot here is perpendicular to the camera, perpendicular to where I'm throwing, if I max rear hip coil, my chest is already almost facing 180 degrees away from the target before I've even done any shoulder coiling. But if I turned this back halfway to pointing totally backwards, now if I rear hip coil without any shoulder coil, okay, I haven't shoulder coiled yet, now I'm turned way further backwards, and if I add shoulder coil, I'm facing, this way, and it's kind of hard to run up that way towards my target when I'm turned so far backwards. So that's kind of part of the reason why you don't want to turn the rear foot back too much, because then if you fully coil everything, you get turned so far back that it starts to become a little bit awkward. Also, you don't need to absolutely max out your rear hip coil and your shoulder coil to get really high power, but you need to do a decent amount of them generally.
Many pros do have their rear foot turned like halfway backwards, but they're still able to get enough rear hip coil or be powerful or explosive enough with a smaller amount of it. But if you're not a pro and you're not built like a pro, then putting yourself in a position to get a little bit more coiling could probably help. So I try to have my rear foot not be turned back more than halfway backwards.
All right, a couple quick drills. I'll later make a more thorough drill video for rear hip coil, but just what I've shown with how to rear hip coil. Balance on your back leg, lift your front leg, bend your knee, and just rotate your whole body on this rear hip. don't twist your upper body yet, don't shoulder coil yet, just feel this individually. This is also going to build up your balance. Leveling up to another progression on this is to do it with your heel off the ground. It's going to require even more balance. It's okay to put your plant foot down after you've done the coiling. And if you take your shoe off, it'll require even more balance when you do it on with your heel off the ground. Another way to feel it is, and I use these to warm up, get, again, balance on that rear leg, bend forward like this, extend your knee, and now you're going to externally rotate the rear hip and now internally rotate the rear hip. The internal rotation of the rear hip, that's the rear hip coil, but I'm just doing it in a different kind of stance now, so it looks differently. Now I'll have to make a separate video on the run-up, but just a quick like preview of how this relates to the run-up. If you rear hip coil, I cannot run up like this. That's why you don't do it until you've gotten to your X step and you have forward momentum, so you can just balance on the rear hip coil, and your forward momentum carries you forward. You're not having to run anymore. The momentum is just carrying you. You can still drive off the rear leg though. Like if I'm doing a one step, I would go like this, rear hip coil and drive. And that's another great way to practice rear hip coiling, is with a one step. You know, bend the knee, balance on it, rear hip coil, and shift your weight forward. And I haven't even shoulder coiled yet. And with a one step, since you don't already have momentum from your run up, you'll be able to learn how to rear hip coil and drive off of that rear leg while you're rear hip coiling together. Balance, rear hip coil, drive forward to create some forward weight shift and momentum into your brace. All right, the last piece of coiling, we had rear hip coil, shoulder coil, now side bend. Side bend, it's just what it sounds, bending at the side. You can feel it in your core muscles. Your obliques are along the side. This is a little bit different because it's not a twisting motion or a rotation motion. It's a different motion. It largely happens automatically, I think, for most people when they just coil. And it's different than hip hinge for hyzer. Right, this is hip hinge forward for hyzer. This is side bending this way, side bending that way. But I think I'm still collecting my thoughts on this one, but I think it's related to angle control mostly, but also adds some more, recruitment of muscles throughout the core to add some power. All right, so just to clarify, hyzer hip hinge is like this. Upper body's leaning forward in this direction, which is west. This is north, where I'm running up. This is east. This is south towards the camera. So my upper body's leaning west. Right now my hips are facing that way. That's why this hip hinge leans that way. Also, just some other tips. When I hyzer hip hinge, I think about kind of closing a car door with my butt. Get the butt back, helps my weight stay balanced, so I'm not just leaning forward and my weight's too far forward. And then I also remind myself to not be extending my lower back. Use my core. Anyway, so side bend is different than this, right? This is side bend. But before I start coiling, the hyzer hip hinge goes in the direction my hips are. But once I start coiling, my hips are now facing this way with rear hip coil. So now, if I rear hip coil a lot, especially if my back foot's turned a little bit back, I get facing with my hips facing more backwards. Now, hyzer hip hinge is this way. I'm leaning backwards in relation to where I'm running up, where my target is. This sets me up to now crank my weight over like this, which we see a lot of amateurs do. That's not good. That's how you topple over your brace. Hard to control your angles and your swing plane that way. So instead, when side bend does happen automatically, the body is maintaining this leaning in this westward direction like this. Now, I don't have that hyzer hip hinge. I have this side bend to maintain that lean, maintain my balance as I'm running up north to throw. So, even though it happens mostly automatically for many people, it could be useful to feel it separately and be able to see it separately to diagnose issues that you may be having with your hyzer, or your launch angle is the other thing it affects. Notice my shoulders are tilting when I side bend. So naturally, if I'm standing sideways and I'm looking to throw up, I would have to crank my neck to look up, except side bend makes it so I don't have to do that. So it happens naturally when people line up a higher shot and then they reach back, side bending if they're on hyzer, side bending the opposite way, coming back into hip hinge, and then side bending to throw upwards. Sometimes when I make a change in my form, I lose some of my natural hyzer, especially, for example, if I'm pulling through higher, I lose some hyzer, because when the arm is lower, it's easier for there to be more hyzer. So then I have to think about, how do I get more hyzer? How do I get my hyzer back? And when I think only about hinging forward at the hips, I sometimes coil and then I get back to just my normal position, and I didn't add the extra hyzer I was trying to add. But feeling the side bend makes me feel some different things that can help me get back to that extra hyzer. So for example, if I'm standing up more straight, throwing on very little hyzer, my off arm when I coil feels like it's going back around my back. But when I'm hip hinged and then I'm coiling into side bend, now my off arm feels like it's going up and over my back. When I think about this, I usually get a lot more hyzer. I come back into a lot more of that hip hinge as I start uncoiling. So that's helped me. All right, we made it. That's coiling. I think I covered most of it from my current understanding. If you like this kind of content, let me know in the comments, and I will try to do more of it sooner rather than later.